You ever read something on your phone that just makes you go? That's me almost every time I log online. So, in the words of Zebra Cats,
I'ma give that bitch some knowledge. I'ma take that bitch to college.
Time to learn some history, bitch. Did you read that on the internet? I just wish people would actually read something before forming their opinion, you know? You're being ableist. Holy shit, where'd you come from? What'd you say? Telling people to read is ableist. I do feel like there's also been a lot of conflation or confusion between literacy or intellectualism and elitism or ableism. More people have become disillusioned with formal education, and as the Canadian equivalent of an Ivy League dropout, you really could count me as one of them, especially knowing the racist histories behind standardized testing and IQ tests. A lot of the ways that we've traditionally been taught to identify or measure intellect are racist and ableist. And I agree that degrees are often useless measures of competence or experience or expertise, and lived experience is often undervalued as a measure of expertise. But I feel like some people can't tell the difference between elitists and people with more practical knowledge. There are a lot of academics who use a lot of $10 words to obscure the fact that they aren't actually saying anything, and there are people who get dismissed because they're actually able to explain things in plain and relatable ways. And yeah, reading textbooks is not the pinnacle of education, but some jargon gets produced through subcultural movements, owned and popularized through community conversations and organizing completely outside of academic institutions. In fact, there's a lot of academic jargon that started off that way and only entered into academia as elitist institutions finally conceded to at least explore the possibility that uneducated working class people might know what they're talking about. And lived experience doesn't only mean our personal individual experiences of our identity. Lived experience also includes what we learn from being in conversation with our communities, from what we witness and are taught by the other people in our lives, from the history we refuse to erase even if it's a little uncomfortable or complicated to explain. Sometimes the people who get called elitists are actually just people who know what they're talking about, and were paying attention to the lessons their elders had learned for them. So maybe we need to do a little bit of a history lesson. Someone decided to join me. As I mentioned before, traditionally, literacy refers to a person's ability to read or write because of the dominant academic belief that the invention of writing, often credited to either Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform from at least 3000 BCE, marked the beginning of historical record and the passing of knowledge. But this, most likely very intentionally, excluded the histories shared through oral traditions and traditional knowledge, like those of early indigenous societies of Africa and Turtle Island. As I see you. The language has existed, as one of my university professors, Marcel Danesi, writes, as long as humans have existed, and it's been linked with myth and with sacred ritual. He goes on to say, myths functioned as narrative theories of existence, constituting the foundational stories for all societies, and that these myths are little theories of the world attempting to explain natural processes or events in both their sound symbolism and their metaphorical semantics. This lines up with what the Elements of Indigenous Style Guide says when it refers to the indigenous voice, the creation and expression of cultures of indigenous peoples. It says, the indigenous voice is in dialogue with oral traditions and traditional knowledge, a process alive with connection and transformation. Oral traditions comprise the stories that have been told for generations, many of which as sacred stories. Traditional knowledge is a wider category. It includes, for example, indigenous architecture, forest management with fire, medicines and herbology, and knowledge about climate patterns and animal migrations. I should probably mention that the dismissal of oral traditions as civilized knowledge not only erased the validity of indigenous histories globally, but also is the root of patriarchal stigma around gossip and whisper networks used by women to share knowledge and warn each other of predators, as well as pidgin languages like Creole and AAVE used by colonized people to communicate between groups with different mother tongues that wouldn't be understood by their colonizers. What are you doing? As we learned with reading comprehension, our language skills can predict our capacity for reading comprehension, though how both of those are measured can be problematic still. The point is that what we think of as literacy has expanded. The Wikipedia page on literacy now lists digital and statistical literacy as forms of literacy as well. Now that we have a bit more history behind the problems with how we've traditionally defined literacy, we can see that the issue of elitism isn't with using jargon, but in whose histories and knowledges are devalued and erased, and who gets to decide what are legitimate forms of knowledge. But we've got to keep digging into history a bit more to really understand how literacy, or lack thereof, is used as a means of control and division. Writing did transform our ability to share knowledge on a wider scale, though that also came with its own pros and cons. It did allow for documentation, specifically documentation that could retain its original meaning to some extent, but that's also been used to portray knowledge as unchanging and indisputable, which it very much isn't. It also relied on both the writer and the reader to be literate in order to disseminate the knowledge. And that's how literacy became a marker for class status. Up until relatively recently, reading and writing were considered the domain of leisure classes, as an upper-class society who would have the time and the means to spend learning to read and write. There was also a gender divide in this regard as well, I should mention. However, if you were a peasant or in the trades, literacy was considered a luxury few were able to afford, especially since up until about the mid-15th century, text had to be handwritten. If you wanted to make another copy, you had to hand transcribe it again. The Catholic Church had hundreds of monks spending day after day transcribing new copies. This made books both rare and rather expensive and difficult to produce, which is why the Church used sermons and mass to spread the word of God. Most average people couldn't have their own copy of the Bible, and even if they could, most wouldn't have been able to read it anyways, especially since it was written in Latin. This meant that most parishioners had to rely on their priests to read and translate the biblical text to them, rather than reading for themselves, giving priests power over how the texts were interpreted and orated. Then in 1440, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, in what is now known as Germany, but was at the time a part of the Holy Roman Empire, initiating what's called the Printing Revolution with the first printing of an edition of the Bible. This made books cheaper and easier to produce, leading to increased production, writers being able to make a living, and increased literacy rates. While the Church made use of the press to print religious texts and pamphlets, it also allowed formerly virtually unknown writers and more controversial texts to make it to the public sphere, resulting in ideas being able to be shared across Europe. However, this did exclude women, racialized people, and others who weren't deemed people politically, which is important to note considering it's only a few decades after Gutenberg first printed the Bible on his printing press that Spain would launch the beginnings of European colonization. Literacy was still in the domain of what was called the leisured classes, though that had expanded to include a growing middle class, although it was still quite discouraged in women and racialized people. It was often only used to impose European colonial beliefs onto them to make them easier to control, such as with residential schools in what is now known as Canada. As another of my professors, Arnold Itwaru, writes in his 1994 book, Closed Entrances, these literatures are some of the means through which the culture in the making contemplates itself, mythologizes its history, justifies its centralizing preoccupations, constructs a vision of itself through which it gathers momentum and guards against obstacles as it seeks conditions favorable to its notions of its very own well-being. In these, the imperialization of vision teaches, among other grievous concerns, approval of the atrocity of conquest, pride in the expansion of European and British colonial military occupation overseas, as it has been fondly styled, as it's vital in furbishing the psychopathic egoism required to justify the violation and robbery of hundreds of millions of people in their own lands, including the slaughter of more than 100 million of them just within the last 600 years of empire glory. Then came the Industrial Revolution and the advent of mass production in the 19th century, making production even faster and cheaper and creating a surge of new reading material, including books for the masses, that is, genre and pulp fiction, considered lowbrow reading material for the less educated and sophisticated public, who now suddenly had more access than ever to literature. This included science fiction, fantasy, romance, for those vapid, starry-eyed women of course, horror, and whatever other genres that are still often disregarded in more academic literary communities, which I'm sure has nothing to do with the prevalence of marginalized writers within them. But we do know that restricting access to education was still a means of control. In 1926, a sugar planter named Mr. E.A. Robinson told a select committee of the Legislative Council of Trinidad and Tobago, "Unless you put the children onto working in the fields when they are young, you will never get them to do so later. If you do educate the whole mass of the agricultural population, you will be deliberately ruining the country." This was the beginning of the publishing industry as we know it now, leading to the institution of copyright laws, literary agents, and the commercialization of literature. But this commercialization also eventually led to the creation of audiobooks through books on tape, opening up access to literacy to children, blind people, and others who struggled with what I'm going to refer to as visual reading, since I think auditory reading is just as valid. Hi, editing dev. Sorry for the computer fan noise, but I feel like my point wasn't clear here. But I came across a quote from Angela Davis's autobiography about political education with the Black Panthers on Twitter that I did want to add here. She says, "When we read Lenin's State and Revolution, there were sisters and brothers in the class whose public school education had not even allowed them to learn how to read. Some of them told me how they had stayed with the book for many painful hours, often using the dictionary to discover the meaning of scores of words on one page, until finally they could grasp the significance of what Lenin was saying. When they explained, for the benefit of the other members of the class, what they had gotten out of their reading, it was clear that they knew it all." I don't come from a well-educated family like many of my peers, but my family has always been avid learners, using whatever resources they had to satiate their desire to expand their knowledge and minds. And so that's what I'm trying to get at here with literacy. It is a skill, it is something you have to work at, but it's not something that is impossible. We just may need to be using the media that works with the way that we learn in particular on an individual level. Hope that was clear. The end of the 1800s brought these films were short, usually only up to a few minutes long each, but they were accompanied by lectures, music, and a lot of audience participation. Although they did not have synchronized dialogue, they were not silent as they were sometimes described. But eventually they grew longer and began to feature narrative storytelling. The first film with synchronized dialogue came out in 1927, and by the 30s, the talkies had taken over. At this point, most actors began as stage actors, and their acting styles reflected that. On stage, you have to act to be understood by the whole audience, including those at the very back. So emotions and actions were highly exaggerated, so even if their faces weren't clear, you knew what they were supposed to be acting like. With the transition to screens, we started to get a shift to more nuanced and realistic kinds of acting, since you could get close-ups on screen.
That's the crucial difference, that the camera is very like somebody just in the room with you. It concentrates very partially on you, usually on the face, and the body can be doing what it wants. That's why so often when wonderful film actors step out onto a stage, you have the same reaction as you did with that young girl who's only acted 3 times. You say, what's happening with those hands?
I've seen a lot of videos already going over the history of movies and films. I've already put a bunch of them together in a playlist, along with a bunch of other videos I think really touch on a lot of great things about media literacy. You can check those out to get deeper into that. But for now, I'll move on. The Industrial Revolution also brought along with it new types of media. In the 1920s, the radio, the precursor to the podcast, was the first non-print media to reach audiences in the privacy of their homes, right as mass production altered society towards consumer-driven culture. Americans in the 1920s were the first to wear ready-made exact-size clothing, to play electric phonographs, to use electric vacuum cleaners, to listen to commercial radio broadcasts, and to drink fresh orange juice year-round. It's almost funny that radio started off pretty much the same way as podcasts have gained popularity, as easy-peasy marketing strategies, although the parallel feels a little more chilling after I ran across the next quote. The consumerist impulse drove production to unprecedented levels, but when the Depression began and consumer demand dropped dramatically, the surplus of production helped further deepen the economic crisis, as more goods were being produced than could be sold. But the early years of radio also included a lot of adaptations and experimentation, leading to the much-famed War of the Worlds radio adaptation that would convince Americans across the country that a real, live alien invasion was happening.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's something I haven't mentioned in all this excitement, but it's becoming more distinct. Perhaps you've caught it already on your radio. Listen, please.
It also had an incredible impact on communities outside of urban centers that didn't benefit from the increasing industrialization. When I was a producer of Radio Lumi for Luminato Festival Toronto last year, I got to sit in on an incredible interview conducted by Hopadina Adler with performer Olivia Ike Duncan and director Laurence Dauphiné about their production of a play called Alapi, which was adapted from a radio play Dauphiné produced first. In this interview, they spoke about how important radio was to Inuit communities in northern Canada. I found this quote by Dauphiné really compelling.
It was kind of the social cement for so many communities, partly because the internet is not accessible everywhere, TV is not necessarily accessible everywhere, and it's limited, and because also radio has been a tool for cultural emancipation. Well, at first, the CBC and Radio Canada were up north in French and English, but in the 70s, there were such a rich community network of radio stations in Inuktitut that were formed.
Radio still continues to be important to these communities that still don't have reliable access to the internet. Elise Danielle Legault wrote in a 2020 issue of Air Inuit, "In many ways, radio has become the modern extension of the Inuit's tradition of oral transmission. Today, elders will occasionally call directly into the station to share stories about life on the land. Despite the emergence of internet and digital communication, radio in the North remains the most social of all media. Public announcer, guardian of language and culture, jukebox, phone directory, for all it represents, radio cultivates a sense of belonging which continues to resonate across communities and generations." I wonder if that's related to why podcasting has become crucial to coverage of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people from Indigenous journalists like Connie Walker, creator of Stolen and Missing and Murdered. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. In the more urbanized areas, however, the heyday of radio began to decline by the 40s with the next new media invention: the television. The book, Understanding Media and Culture, outlines some uncanny insights into its impact on culture. Broadcast television was the dominant form of mass media, and the three major networks controlled more than 90% of the news programs, live events, and sitcoms viewed by Americans. Some social critics argue that television was fostering a homogeneous, conformist culture by reinforcing ideas about what normal American life looked like. But television also contributed to the counterculture of the 1960s. The Vietnam War was the nation's first televised military conflict, and nightly images of war footage and war protesters helped intensify the nation's internal conflicts. But in a video by Verity Ritchie called The Consumerist Dystopia of Harry Potter, she describes how it also became weaponized by advertisers. One of the things that makes TV so great for advertisers is that your audience includes little kids, those far too young to read, and it does so in the comfort and safety of their living room. Parents are irrelevant to that interaction, except for their wallets. Parents cannot resist the pull of their children's wishes, and children get their wishes from TV advertisements. But parents started to catch on to this exploitation of their kids, who couldn't really tell the difference between an ad and their favorite educational show.
The favorite foods of the house hippo are chips, raisins, and the crumbs from peanut butter on toast. They build their nests in bedroom closets, using lost mittens, dryer lint, and bits of string. The nests have to be very soft and warm. House hippos sleep about 16 hours a day.
That looked really real, but you knew it couldn't be true, didn't you?
Mom, I want a house hippo. It's almost like there's a pattern or something. Anyways, cue the 90s, the birth of me, and cable TV, and the boom of premium channels and cable packages to meet all your super niche market interests, bringing us to the new era of media. Now, the internet and video games had already been around for a while at this point, but they were fairly limited and inaccessible to most people until about the early 2000s, after we survived Y2K, of course, and became obsessed with digital media. But that was also the story for a whole lot of web forums that predated Reddit and Tumblr. People also started their own blogs, either to journal about their own lives, or spread the good word about their favorite media or special interests, or just to put their fiction and poetry somewhere that wasn't just a floppy disk that would mysteriously get corrupted after a few months persistently forestalling any book-length projects by the time you got about 20 pages in. But how else were you supposed to save it on your family computer where your parents could find it and all your weird, disturbing little 10-year-old thoughts? But it was a place of exploration and curiosity.
How are you, gentlemen? All your days are belong to us. You are on the way to destruction.
What you say?
You have no chance to survive, mate, your time. All your base, all your base, belong to us.
There was Neopets and Habbo Hotel and Newgrounds and Miniclip.com. There was an internet scavenger hunt game called NotProd. You can watch entire pirated movies on YouTube, broken up into 10-minute segments, of course. It had its very own War of the Worlds and Blair Witch Project with Lonely Girl 15. And before YouTube and Google, you had to use services like Napster and LimeWire to download images and AMVs from other internet users around the world. You could borrow CDs from the library and rip them onto your computer, or torrent them online, creating a catalog of thousands and thousands of songs from across the decades. We even had the first video podcast, as the iPod released a model with enough storage for video content. Okay, also not to be that old man who waxes poetic about how perfect and innocent the days of its youth were while glossing over the uglier parts that were still happening. The early internet was definitely not all sunshine and rainbows. There was definitely reason that Gen Xers and older generations were so terrified of it for a while. Just see the Danger.com book series if you want to understand what I mean. The internet also birthed the phenomenon we now call fandom. There were fan clubs and book clubs before the internet, but it opened up a whole new world for fans of all kinds of media. I don't know if anybody else remembers the website Quizilla. It started off as a relatively simple user-generated quiz site. It was like the originator of those BuzzFeed quizzes that were going around for a while. It started off with things like, what Greek god are you? What anime character are you most like? Which soon became, who would you choose? The demon, the vampire, the werewolf, or the sorcerer? Which supernatural character would fall in love with you? Until 12-year-olds were learning CSS to write full-blown self-insert fiction and fan fiction, until the website changed its design to include a story section before the spin-off sites Fiction Press and fanfiction.net or whatever launched. And as Verity Ritchie notes in another of her videos, Taking Back Harry Potter, this time of fandom happened to coincide right as the angsty Wizard Boy books gained international popularity, making it the perfect vehicle to turn the young adult market into the greedy, profit-driven shit pile it is now. And as long as people are still focused on the franchise, there's money to be made for the IP owners. And fandom doesn't just improve the experience of the fans, it also helps promote the original work. A little later, she says, there's actually academic research on fandoms and companies' relationships to it, and lots of researchers have suggested fandom is actually unpaid labor that adds a lot of value to the properties it forms around. Now, I used to really enjoy the Harry Potter books when I was 8, but by the time I was about 12 or 13 and the 6th book finally came out, I felt wholly disenchanted by the series, only continuing to watch the movies because it was one of the few things my entire friend group would actually agree to watch together. I hated Harry Potter before it was cool. Anyways, I've been talking long enough already, but Harry Potter also changed the actual landscape of young adult fiction. Constance Grady wrote for Vox in 2017. Teenage readers primed by the outsiders wanted to read voices that sounded like their own. They wanted to read about problems that felt authentic and gritty. As Harry Potter became an unexpected crossover success, middle grade and YA novels became conflated in the cultural conversation. A voracious appetite arose for books aimed at children that adults would enjoy too, and that appetite quickly shorthanded itself into books for teens. After The Outsiders, which came out in 1967, the teen or young adult market was the second smallest publishing market, but they focused on real-life issues that teens struggled with navigating or talking about with adults, like social class warfare, drugs, and woohoo. I mean, Flowers in the Attic was a young adult novel from 1979, and right as I reached the age to finally appreciate the gritty possibilities of the genre, it shifted swiftly and seemingly irreversibly towards a more sanitized and honestly rather redundant direction.
I can't believe you've done this.
Anyways, my point is that media in general has changed significantly since the internet, and not just by how it impacts young developing brains, but how it's found a way to capitalize on young fans, inevitably disrupting their growth as they become older fans, in a way that even TV couldn't do.
Where did you get all these nice things?
Internet? If rampant transphobia, anti-Semitism, and racism was enough to get you to stop supporting Rowling, maybe the fact that she made kids worse readers is.
Who's that Pokemon? It's
Capitalism. In 2007, the world as we knew it would change forever. I became a 9th grade emo. It was also the year that the first iPhone would come out.
And we are calling it iPhone.
The distinction between reality and the digital world crumbled away. You no longer had to wait until you could log onto your computer to check your emails or your Facebook notifications. Now it's always with you, sometimes conveniently as close as in your very own pocket. I actually wrote a blog post about this last May. Even with TV, there is a sense of distance, disconnection. It's a little play put on by little people in a little box with regular intermissions to blare advertisements that are never the same volume as the program. Social media feels intimately close. You're peeking through a little window into someone's real life, sometimes in real time. For some folks, that's entirely accurate, but for a lot of people, it's just as scripted and directed and edited and even fictionalized as any other medium. I can post about someone, not tag them or message them, but they can still find it and read it, and I may not ever even know. If you aren't constantly cognizant of that, you can cause some real damage without ever even realizing it. You used to only have to care about reporters, and aside from tabloids, most of them have to abide by a set of ethics and standards, which admittedly in the past were mostly problematic. Now it's a free-for-all. You don't even have to pay for postage to send hate mail now. And our phones now come with cameras, with increasing capacities to take higher quality photos and videos, achieving qualities that rival their cinematic counterparts, to document, improve, and advertise with. And instead of going to websites, bookmarking our favorite blogs and webcomics and news sites, our social media timelines became our primary source of news and information. Over the last 15 years, these timelines have shifted from the chaos of chronological posts from the people we follow or friend to algorithmically calculated streams of recommended content based on both what you engage with and what drives engagement, alongside posts that someone paid money to force onto your feed to keep people hooked on the advertisement conveyor belt. I think the big lesson that we can take away from all of this is that the real enemy here
is capitalism.
I mean, really, can you say that I'm wrong?
You're gonna look at me and you're gonna tell me that I'm wrong? Am I wrong?
But seriously, what the last 6 months have taught me is how important it is to hold onto and understand the histories we participate in and to think critically about the information we've been fed. And I hope this helps you in understanding your own histories as well.